Paris, December 2, 1804. A man who, 15 years earlier, had been an obscure artillery officer from a minor Mediterranean island, took the imperial crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. He had risen through revolution, conquered most of Europe, rewritten the laws of nations, and within a decade, he would lose it all on a frozen Russian road and a muddy Belgian field. This is the story of how Napoleon Bonaparte built an empire on genius and ambition, and how the very forces that made him unstoppable also guaranteed his fall. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, just 1 year after France had annexed the island from the Republic of Genoa. His family, the Bonapartes, belonged to the minor Corsican nobility, respected locally, but far from wealthy, and far from the centers of power in Paris. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer who navigated the politics of the new French administration skillfully enough to secure scholarships for his sons. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a woman of formidable discipline, and Napoleon would later credit her with instilling in him the iron self-control that defined his character. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to study, first at a religious school in Autun, then at the military academy at Brienne-le-Château. He arrived speaking poor French, with a thick Corsican accent and a name his classmates mocked. He was an outsider in a country that was not yet fully his own, and this sense of being an outsider, talented but unrecognized, would shape his ambition for the rest of his life. At Brienne, he excelled in mathematics, a subject crucial to artillery science, and showed an early fascination with the campaigns of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. He read voraciously, often alone, developing the strategic mind that would later reshape the map of Europe. In 1784, he was accepted into the elite École Militaire in Paris, where he trained as an artillery officer, graduating in just 1 year instead of the usual 2 or 3, a testament to his ability. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1785, at 16 years old. For the next several years, he was a competent but unremarkable junior officer, stationed in provincial garrisons, reading widely on history, geography, and the writings of the Enlightenment philosophers who were beginning to question the foundations of the French monarchy itself. Then, in 1789, the French Revolution erupted. The storming of the Bastille, the fall of the absolute monarchy, the rise of revolutionary fervor, all of it created a kind of chaos that, for a young man of talent without aristocratic connections, was nothing short of an opportunity. The old French army, built on a rigid hierarchy that rewarded noble birth over competence, was being dismantled. Officers who had once blocked the advancement of men like Napoleon were emigrating, fleeing the revolution, or being purged. Suddenly, merit, or at least, the appearance of merit combined with political reliability, could carry a man upward at extraordinary speed. Napoleon initially divided his attention between France and Corsica, where he became entangled in the island's chaotic revolutionary politics, aligning himself first with Corsican nationalist factions and then breaking violently with them. By 1793, he and his family were forced to flee Corsica entirely, settling in France as refugees with little money and uncertain prospects. It was a humiliating moment, but it also severed his last ties to the island and forced him to commit fully to a French military career. That same year, the opportunity that would launch him arrived at the Siege of Toulon. The city had risen against the revolutionary government and invited British naval forces to occupy its port. The French army assigned to retake it had bungled its artillery strategy badly, and Napoleon, then a young captain, was given command of the siege artillery somewhat by chance. He proposed and ultimately executed a bold plan, instead of bombarding the city directly, his guns would target the forts commanding the harbor, making it untenable for the British fleet to remain. The plan worked. Toulon fell, the British withdrew, and Napoleon, wounded in the thigh during the action, was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. It was an explosive ascent few in the French army had ever witnessed. The years that followed were turbulent. The revolution had devolved into the terror under Robespierre, with mass executions and political purges sweeping through France. Napoleon's patron at Toulon had revolutionary connections that briefly put him under suspicion after Robespierre's fall in 1794, and he spent months in a kind of political limbo. His career stalled, his finances desperate. He even contemplated leaving the army altogether. His fortunes turned again in October 1795, when royalist insurgents threatened to overthrow the fragile revolutionary government in Paris itself. The government, the Directory, desperately needed a commander who could defend the convention. Napoleon was given the task, and he responded with brutal efficiency, using artillery, what he and others later called a whiff of grape shot, to disperse the royalist crowds in the streets of Paris. Hundreds were killed or wounded. It was decisive, ruthless, and effective, and it cemented Napoleon as a man the Directory could rely upon in moments of crisis. This event proved pivotal not just militarily but socially. Napoleon was now a hero of the regime, welcomed into Parisian society. It was during this period that he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior with 2 children, who moved in fashionable Directory circles. Their courtship was passionate and fast. They married in March 1796. Days later, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy, a posting many considered a punishment assignment, given to an army that was poorly supplied, poorly paid, and considered a secondary front compared to the war against Austria on the Rhine. What followed astonished all of Europe. Taking command of a demoralized, ragged force, Napoleon transformed it through sheer force of will, promising his soldiers glory and plunder in the rich cities of northern Italy. He then launched a campaign of breathtaking speed and audacity, defeating larger Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a series of battles, Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, through superior speed, the concentration of force at decisive points, and his uncanny ability to read a battlefield and anticipate his enemy's next move. Within a year, he had knocked Piedmont out of the war, conquered most of northern Italy, and forced Austria to the negotiating table, dictating peace terms largely on his own authority, often exceeding the instructions given to him by the civilian government in Paris. The Italian campaign made Napoleon a national hero and, more significantly, gave him direct experience in something beyond warfare, governance. He reorganized conquered Italian territories, redrew borders, established new republics, and looted Italian art treasures to send back to Paris, all decisions made largely independent of the Directory's oversight. He understood, with remarkable clarity, that military victory was only useful insofar as it translated into political power. By 1797, the man who had been an anonymous garrison officer just 8 years earlier was perhaps the single most famous person in France, and the Directory, suspicious of his popularity but unable to do without his talents, sought a new mission that might keep him occupied, and away from Paris. In 1798, the Directory approved Napoleon's own proposal for a campaign that would, in theory, strike at British interests indirectly, an invasion of Egypt, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. The stated military goal was to threaten Britain's trade routes to India. The deeper, unstated motive on the Directory's part was simpler, to send a dangerously popular general somewhere far away. Napoleon, for his part, was drawn by genuine fascination with the ancient world and by the romantic possibility of emulating Alexander the Great's eastern conquests. The campaign began with early successes. Napoleon's forces captured Malta, then landed in Egypt and won a decisive victory at the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798, breaking the Mamluk cavalry that had ruled Egypt for centuries. He brought with him not only soldiers but scientists, engineers, and scholars, the famous Commission des Sciences et des Arts, whose work, including the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, would launch the modern field of Egyptology. It was characteristic of Napoleon's self-image, a conqueror, yes, but also a man of the Enlightenment, bringing science and rational administration to lands he considered backward. But the Egyptian campaign soon turned into a strategic catastrophe. Just weeks after the Battle of the Pyramids, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson annihilated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, destroying or capturing nearly every ship and effectively trapping Napoleon's army in Egypt, cut off from reinforcement or resupply. Napoleon pressed on regardless, marching into Ottoman Syria in 1799, but his siege of Acre failed disastrously, his army ravaged by plague and exhaustion. Recognizing the campaign was unwinnable, Napoleon made a decision that revealed much about his character. He abandoned his army in Egypt, secretly slipping past the British blockade with a small group of officers to return to France, leaving subordinates to manage the eventual surrender of the forces he left behind. Astonishingly, this abandonment did little to damage his reputation at home. News of the Egyptian disasters traveled more slowly and less clearly than news of his earlier triumphs, and the French public, weary of a corrupt and ineffective Directory government plagued by economic crisis, military setbacks in Europe, and political instability, was eager for a strong figure to restore order. Napoleon returned to a France in crisis and immediately began conspiring with other dissatisfied politicians, most notably the Director Emmanuel Joseph Size, to overthrow the Directory. The coup came on 18–19 Brumaire, November 9–10, of 1799. The plan was for Napoleon to use his military authority to intimidate the legislative councils into dissolving the existing government and replacing it with a new structure dominated by 3 consuls. The execution was nearly disastrous. Napoleon, addressing the council of 500 directly, was shouted down, physically threatened, and reportedly nearly fainted under the pressure, requiring his brother Lucien, who presided over the council, to intervene and order troops to clear the chamber by force. It was a coup that succeeded not through brilliant execution but through the sheer exhaustion and political vacuum of the existing regime. The legislators capitulated largely because resistance seemed futile. The result was the Constitution of the Year 8, which established the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul holding power that dwarfed his 2 co-consuls in practice. Over the next several years, he systematically expanded and entrenched this authority. He centralized administrative power, replacing locally elected officials with prefects appointed directly by the central government. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, restoring Catholicism's status in France and healing a major social wound left by the Revolution's anti-clerical policies, while still keeping the Church subordinate to the state. He reformed the chaotic French tax and financial system, established the Bank of France, and oversaw the drafting of the Napoleonic Code, which standardized civil law across France based on principles of legal equality, secular authority, and property rights, a legal framework that would later be exported, directly or by influence, to dozens of countries. In foreign affairs, Napoleon negotiated the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, bringing a temporary peace with Britain and ending nearly a decade of continuous warfare in Europe. The peace was wildly popular in France and elevated Napoleon's prestige further. That same year, a national referendum made him first consul for life, and by 1804, with the discovery of a royalist assassination plot used as justification, the French Senate proposed, and another referendum overwhelmingly approved, the establishment of a hereditary empire, with Napoleon as Emperor of the French. His coronation on December 2, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral was a calculated piece of political theater. Pope Pius VII traveled to Paris to bless the ceremony, but in a moment that became legendary, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head himself, rather than allowing the Pope to crown him, a deliberate statement that his authority derived from his own achievement and the will of the French people, not from divine sanction through the Church. The man who had been an obscure Corsican cadet just 2 decades earlier now ruled as emperor over the most powerful nation in continental Europe, and he was only 35 years old. The peace with Britain proved short-lived. War resumed in 1803, and Britain began assembling coalitions of continental powers, Austria, Russia, and later Prussia, to contain French power, terrified by both Napoleon's military dominance and the revolutionary ideals his empire continued to export across Europe, even if Napoleon himself had become increasingly autocratic. The Napoleonic Wars proper, the series of conflicts that would consume the continent for the next decade, were about to begin in earnest. The years immediately following Napoleon's coronation marked the zenith of his military and political power. In 1805, Britain, Austria, and Russia formed the Third Coalition against France. Napoleon responded with a campaign that military historians still study as a masterpiece of operational planning. Abandoning his planned invasion of Britain, he marched the Grande Armée, a force he had spent years training and organizing into a highly mobile, self-sufficient fighting machine, across Europe at extraordinary speed, encircling an Austrian army at Ulm and forcing its surrender without a major battle. He then advanced into Austria itself, occupying Vienna, before achieving the single greatest victory of his career at the Battle of Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation. Facing a combined Austro-Russian force that significantly outnumbered his own, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank to lure the enemy into overextending their attack, then unleashed a devastating counterstrike through the center of their line. The result was a near-total destruction of the coalition army and Austria's withdrawal from the war. The following year, Prussia, alarmed by France's growing dominance, joined the war against Napoleon, only to suffer catastrophic defeats at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt in October 1806, where Napoleon's forces effectively destroyed the Prussian army in a single day, exposing the obsolescence of Prussia's once feared 18th-century military doctrines against Napoleon's modern, flexible tactics. Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph. He then turned against Russia, fighting a brutally costly but inconclusive battle at Eylau in February 1807 before achieving a decisive victory at Friedland in June, which brought Russian Tsar Alexander I to the negotiating table. The resulting treaties of Tilsit in 1807 marked the high point of Napoleon's power. He redrew the map of Central Europe extensively, dismantling Prussia's territory, creating the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and most significantly, securing Russian agreement to join the Continental System, an economic blockade designed to cripple Britain by closing all of continental Europe to British trade. For a brief period, Napoleon and Alexander I appeared to function almost as partners, dividing influence over Europe between them. However, cracks were already forming beneath this apparent triumph. The continental system proved difficult to enforce and economically damaging not just to Britain but to the continental economies forced to comply with it, breeding resentment across Europe, including eventually in Russia itself. More immediately damaging was Napoleon's intervention in Spain. In 1808, seeking to tighten control over the Iberian Peninsula and enforce the blockade against Britain there, Napoleon deposed the Spanish Bourbon monarchy and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as king. This act, intended as a swift consolidation of power, instead ignited a ferocious popular insurgency. Spanish guerrilla fighters, supported eventually by British expeditionary forces under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, waged a brutal, grinding war that French forces, despite numerical and technological advantages, could never fully suppress. The Peninsular War became, in the words later applied to it, a Spanish ulcer, draining French manpower, resources, and prestige for years without producing a decisive victory, while also demonstrating to the rest of Europe that Napoleon's armies were not, in fact, invincible. In 1809, Austria attempted another war against Napoleon, hoping to exploit French distraction in Spain. Napoleon defeated Austria again, though the campaign was considerably harder fought than his earlier triumphs. Notably, he suffered a rare tactical defeat at the Battle of Ospernessling before ultimately winning at Wagram. The resulting peace forced Austria into further territorial concessions, and Napoleon, having divorced Josephine due to her inability to produce an heir, married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise in 1810, hoping to cement the alliance through royal blood and secure dynastic legitimacy for his empire. The following year, his son, Napoleon II, was born, seemingly securing his dynasty's future. But the empire Napoleon had built was beginning to show structural strain that mirrored its battlefield successes. The very speed of his conquests meant that occupied and allied territories across Europe were governed by a patchwork of Bonaparte family members, marshals, and client kings whose loyalty often depended more on continued French military dominance than genuine political integration. Nationalist sentiment, paradoxically often inspired by the same revolutionary ideals Napoleon's France had once championed, began to stir in Germany, Italy, and Spain, sentiment that would eventually turn against French occupation itself. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander I, frustrated by the economic damage the continental system inflicted on Russia and unsettled by Napoleon's continued expansion in Eastern Europe, particularly regarding Poland, began to drift away from the Tilsit Partnership, eventually reopening Russian ports to British trade in violation of the blockade. By 1811, relations between France and Russia had deteriorated to the point where war seemed increasingly likely, and Napoleon began assembling what would become the largest army Europe had ever seen, a multinational force exceeding 600,000 men, drawn not only from France but from across his empire and allied states, for an invasion he believed would force Russia back into compliance. The invasion of Russia in 1812 began on June 24, when Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed the Neman River into Russian territory. From the outset, the campaign was undermined by problems that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. The sheer size of the army made logistics extraordinarily difficult, supply lines stretched dangerously thin across vast distances, and the Russian strategy, whether by design or necessity, was to retreat continuously, avoiding decisive battle and drawing the French deeper into Russian territory while scorching the earth behind them, denying Napoleon's forces the supplies and forage they desperately needed. By the time the two armies finally clashed in a major battle at Borodino in September 1812, Napoleon's forces had already been decimated by disease, starvation, and desertion. Borodino itself was among the bloodiest single-day battles in the history of warfare to that point, with both sides suffering enormous casualties, but it proved indecisive. The Russian army withdrew in good order rather than being destroyed, and Napoleon, perhaps fatigued or uncharacteristically cautious, withheld his imperial guard from a potentially decisive final assault. Napoleon occupied Moscow shortly afterward, expecting Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. Instead, the city was set ablaze, likely by Russian authorities determined to deny the French any usable shelter or supplies, and the Tsar refused all negotiation. After waiting in the ruins of Moscow for over a month, Napoleon recognized the position was untenable and ordered a retreat as the Russian winter began to close in. What followed was one of the great military catastrophes in history. The retreating Grande Armée, already weakened, was harassed continuously by Cossack cavalry and Russian regulars, while temperatures plunged far below freezing. Starvation, frostbite, and disease killed far more soldiers than combat did. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became a particular horror, as French forces, trapped between pursuing Russian armies, suffered immense losses fighting their way across. Of the more than 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia that summer, only a small fraction, estimates vary, but likely fewer than 100,000, made it back, and many of those survivors were permanently broken in health. The disaster in Russia shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and emboldened his enemies across Europe. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Britain, and Sweden formed the Sixth Coalition, determined to finish what the Russian winter had begun. Napoleon, with characteristic energy, rebuilt his army with remarkable speed, but the new conscripts lacked the experience and the cavalry of the forces he had lost in Russia. In the autumn of 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, the largest battle in European history prior to the First World War, often called the Battle of Nations, the combined coalition armies decisively defeated Napoleon's forces, forcing a French retreat back across the Rhine. In 1814, coalition armies invaded France itself for the first time since the Revolutionary Wars began 2 decades earlier. Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign with the diminished forces remaining to him, winning several tactical victories against superior numbers, but the strategic situation was hopeless. Paris fell in March 1814, and Napoleon's own marshals, recognizing the cause was lost, refused to continue fighting. Napoleon abdicated in April 1814 and was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, granted sovereignty over it as a face-saving consolation, while the victorious powers restored the Bourbon monarchy in France under Louis XVIII. Napoleon's exile lasted less than a year. The restored Bourbon government proved deeply unpopular, and Napoleon, watching events from Elba, judged correctly that France remained ripe for his return. In February 1815, he escaped Elba with a small group of loyal soldiers, landed in southern France, and marched toward Paris. French troops sent to arrest him instead defected to his side in droves, and Louis XVIII fled the country without a fight. Napoleon entered Paris and resumed power in an episode that became known as the 100 Days. The coalition powers, meeting at the Congress of Vienna to redraw Europe's map after Napoleon's first fall, immediately declared him an outlaw and mobilized for war once again. Napoleon, knowing he had to defeat the coalition armies before they could combine their full strength against him, moved quickly into Belgium to confront the British and Prussian forces separately before they could unite. After initial success against the Prussians at Ligny, Napoleon turned to face the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington near the village of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. The battle was ferocious and, for much of the day, uncertain, as Wellington's forces held their defensive positions against repeated French assaults. The decisive blow came when the Prussian army, having recovered from its defeat at Ligny faster than Napoleon anticipated, arrived on the battlefield late in the day and struck the French right flank. Caught between Wellington's army and the arriving Prussians, Napoleon's forces collapsed. Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time on June 22, 1815. This time, the victorious Allies showed no leniency. He was exiled to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena, thousands of miles from Europe, under British guard, with no possibility of escape or return. He spent his final years there dictating memoirs that would shape his historical legacy for generations, often presenting his own actions in the most favorable possible light. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. The cause of his death has been debated by historians and scientists for 2 centuries, with stomach cancer the most widely accepted explanation, though theories involving arsenic poisoning have also been proposed and remain a subject of some scholarly disagreement, without definitive resolution. Napoleon's legacy remains deeply contested. He was a man who codified legal equality and modern administrative efficiency across much of Europe, yet also reintroduced autocracy and reversed certain revolutionary gains, including the restoration of slavery in French colonies in 1802. He was a military genius whose campaigns are still studied in war colleges worldwide, yet his ambition cost millions of lives across nearly continuous warfare spanning more than a decade. The empire he built collapsed entirely within a year of his final defeat, yet the legal, administrative, and nationalist forces his conquests unleashed across Europe reshaped the continent's political development for the rest of the 19th century and beyond.